She set the pan down at the end of the long table and walked back to the stove without looking at anyone. 14 men. 14 plates. And somehow, when the biscuits were counted, Cord Dalloway's end of the table always had one more. Nobody said anything about it. Not the first time. Not the 20th. That was the summer of 1887 on the Harlan Basin range, and the cattle season had come in hard and fast, the way it did when the winter had been mild and the calves had dropped early and everything that could go right went right all at once, which meant the work was brutal and relentless, and there was no room in any of it for softness or sentiment or anything that couldn't be measured in head count and miles covered before sundown. The cook's name was Nora Vass. She was 31 years old. She had been widowed 2 years prior. She had a daughter named Calla, who was 7 and who slept in a small room off the kitchen and who understood, the way children do, that her mother's silence on certain subjects was a kind of language all its own. And Cord Dalloway was the man at the end of the table. He was not the foreman. He was not the oldest hand. He was not the tallest or the loudest or the one who told the best stories around the fire at night. He was the one who, when he finished his meal, stacked his plate quietly and set his cup on top of it and thanked whoever had cooked without making a production of it. He was the one who, 3 weeks into the season, had noticed that the woodpile outside the kitchen door was getting low and had split 2 hours' worth of cordwood on his own time, without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone. He was the one who, when Calla had dropped her rag doll in the mud near the water trough, had picked it up and cleaned it off on his shirt and handed it back to her, and then gone back to work like nothing had happened. Nora had seen all of it. She had not said a word about any of it either. That was the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. Something that lived in the extra biscuit, in the split wood, in the clean doll handed back without ceremony. Something that moved through the ordinary hours of a working cattle season like water moving under ice, present, purposeful, and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't paying the right kind of attention. The Harlan Basin operation was owned by a man named Gus Harlan, who was 62 and had the disposition of weather, mostly tolerable, occasionally violent, always honest about what it was. He ran a clean outfit. He paid fair wages. He expected the work done and the animals cared for and the books balanced, and he did not involve himself in the personal lives of his employees beyond what was necessary to keep the outfit functioning. He had hired Nora Vass the previous fall after his last cook had left to marry a man in Billings, and he had done so because she had come recommended by a woman he trusted and because she had looked him in the eye when she named her price and had not flinched when he'd been quiet for a moment before agreeing. He had not regretted it. Not once. The bunkhouse ran on her schedule. The men were up before dawn and fed before they rode out. There was always something hot waiting when they came back, regardless of what hour that was. She kept the kitchen the way some people keep at church. Not pristine, not fussy, but ordered in a way that had meaning. Everything in its place because its place mattered. The cast iron seasoned and stacked. The dry goods and labeled tins. The knives sharp. The floor swept twice a day, even when the dust came back in within the hour, which it always did, because that was the nature of a working ranch in a dry summer, and you either made peace with that or you went somewhere else. Nora had made peace with a great many things. She had made peace with the fact that her husband, Dale Vass, had been a good man who had died of a fever that should not have killed him and had anyway, leaving her with a 7-year-old and a small amount of savings and a set of skills that translated directly into the kind of work that kept a roof over both their heads. She had made peace with the fact that cooking for 14 men was not what she had imagined her life becoming, but that it was honest work and it was hers, and she did it well. She had made peace with the loneliness of it, the particular loneliness of being the only woman in a working camp, of being necessary and present and somehow still peripheral, of eating her own meals standing at the stove after everyone else had been served, because sitting down felt like it would require a kind of belonging she hadn't claimed. What she had not made peace with, entirely, was the way Cord Dalloway looked at her sometimes. Not the way some of the other men looked at her, that she knew how to handle. That was a thing with a shape and a solution, and she had navigated it enough times to know exactly how much ice to put in her voice, and exactly how much distance to keep, and exactly how to make the message land without making an enemy of the man who still had to eat at her table for the next 4 months. Cord's looking was different. It wasn't hungry exactly. It was more like careful, like he was reading something in small print and didn't want to misread a word of it, like he was paying a kind of attention that had nothing to do with what he was going to take and everything to do with what he was trying to understand. She found it unsettling in a way she couldn't quite pin down, which was, she supposed, its own kind of answer. The days had a rhythm to them that the season imposed without apology. Up before the light. Fire started. Water on. Biscuits mixed and in the oven before the first boot hit the bunkhouse floor. Bacon when they had it. Salt pork when they didn't. Eggs from the 6 hens Nora kept in a small coop behind the kitchen, rationed carefully across the week, so there was always something to go with the biscuits, and the men never felt the lack too sharply. Coffee, always coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, because that was not a negotiable item on a cattle drive, and she had learned early that the quality of the morning coffee set the tone for everything that followed. The men came in their particular order, which had established itself in the first week and never varied. The 2 youngest hands, a pair of brothers named Pete and Roof, who were 19 and 20 respectively, and who treated every meal like it might be their last, were always first. Then the older hands in a loose cluster, still half asleep and not interested in conversation. Then the foreman, a lean and deliberate man named Aldous, who sat at the head of the table and organized the day's work over his coffee with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this so many times it had become something close to instinct. And then, usually last, Cord. Not because he was slow, not because he was careless about the work. She had watched him enough to know he was neither of those things. He came in last because he checked on the horses first. Every morning, without fail, before he sat down to eat, he walked the line of the corral and looked at every animal and made sure everything was as it should be. It took maybe 10 minutes. It cost him the hottest biscuits and the first pour of coffee. He did it anyway. Nora had started keeping his plate warm on the back of the stove. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was the same consideration she'd give any man who was doing necessary work before his meal. She told herself a great many things that were technically true and were also, she knew at some level, she didn't examine too closely, not the whole of the truth. The extra biscuit had started in the 3rd week. She hadn't planned it. She had pulled the pan from the oven and counted them out, and there had been 1 left over after the 14 plates were set, and she had looked at it for a moment and then put it on Cord's plate, which was the one on the back of the stove, which was the warm one, which was his. And then she had gone back to the stove and not thought about it again. Or had tried not to. The next morning she made 15 biscuits. She told herself it was because the dough had come out a little larger than usual. She was not a woman who lied to herself for very long, but she gave herself that one for a day or 2 before she stopped pretending. Cord never mentioned it. He ate his meal the same way he always did, steadily, without waste, with the focused attention of someone who understood that food was fuel and fuel was work and work was the point. He thanked her the same way. He stacked his plate. He left. And yet, and this was the thing she noticed, the thing she could not unnotice, he always looked at the plate for just a moment before he sat down. Just a beat. A fraction of a second where something moved across his face that was gone before she could name it. And then he ate. She was not a woman given to reading too much into things. She had learned that particular discipline the hard way. But she was also not a woman who could look at a thing that was plainly there and pretend she didn't see it. And what was plainly there in that fraction of a second, in that small and unremarkable pause before a man sat down to his breakfast, was something that looked a great deal like gratitude of a very specific kind. Not the gratitude of a hungry man for a hot meal. Something quieter than that. Something that knew it was being seen. She kept making 15 biscuits. Callan noticed before anyone else, which was not a surprise. Callan noticed everything. She was the kind of child who moved through the world with her eyes wide open and her mouth mostly shut, which was the opposite of most 7-year-olds, and which had more than once made Nora feel a complicated mix of pride and worry. Pride because it was a useful way to be, and worry because she knew where that particular habit came from and what it cost. The girl had taken to sitting on the kitchen steps in the mornings after the men had gone out, doing whatever small task Nora gave her, shelling beans, sorting dried corn, mending the simpler things that needed mending. She didn't get underfoot. She didn't chatter. She watched. One morning in the 5th week, she said, without looking up from the beans she was shelling, "You always give Mr. Cord more." Nora was at the wash basin. She kept her back to her daughter for a moment. "The count comes out uneven sometimes," she said. Calla was quiet. The beans went into the bowl one at a time, each one making a small sound against the others. "He fixed the step," the girl said, "the one that was loose." Nora turned around. "When?" "Yesterday, before supper. I watched him. He had a nail and a piece of wood, and he just fixed it." Nora looked at the step Calla was sitting on. It was solid. It had been loose for 2 weeks, long enough that she'd started stepping over it without thinking about it. The way you do with a problem that isn't urgent enough to address and isn't small enough to stop noticing. She tested it with her foot. It didn't move. She didn't say anything. She went back to the wash basin. "He's nice," Calla said, with the flat certainty of a child who has made a decision and doesn't feel the need to argue it. "Most of the men are nice," Nora said. Calla shelled another bean. "Not like that," she said. And that was the end of the conversation, because Calla knew when a subject was closed and Nora knew that her daughter knew, and they understood each other well enough to leave it there. But Nora stood at the wash basin for a long moment after that, her hands in the water, not moving, thinking about a fixed step, thinking about a man who had done it without saying a word to her, thinking about the particular grammar of that. The way some people said things not with words, but with the careful placement of effort in the direction of someone else's life. She had been married to a man who used words well. Dale had been good with language, good with the particular kind of warmth that came through in how a person talked to you, how they told you things, how they named what they felt. She had loved that about him. She missed it still, the specific texture of being spoken to like you mattered. But she was beginning to understand, standing at the wash basin in the early morning of a long cattle season, that there was more than one language for that. The work of the season was relentless in the way that only a thing you cannot stop can be relentless. Not cruel, exactly, just indifferent to anything that wasn't the work itself. The cattle had to be moved. The calves had to be branded. The range had to be checked and rechecked. The fences that had gone down over the winter had to be found and repaired. The water sources had to be monitored. The books had to be kept. And through all of it, every day, without pause or exception, the men had to be fed. Nora fed them. That was her work, and she did it without complaint and without the performance of sacrifice, which she had always found to be a particularly exhausting kind of dishonesty. She did not pretend the work was easy. She did not pretend it was nothing. It was something. It was hard and it was constant, and it required a kind of sustained attention that left you hollowed out by evening in a way that sleep only partially repaired. She did it because it was hers to do, and because Callan needed the roof, and because, if she was honest, she had found something in the rhythm of it, the fire and the flour and the iron and the heat, that was not happiness exactly, but was close to something solid, something you could stand on. The men respected her. That was not nothing. They were rough in the way that working men are rough, not unkind, mostly, but unpolished, unguarded, operating on a social register that didn't include much in the way of delicacy. They said please and thank you, most of them because Gus Harlan had made clear that this was expected, but they said it the way they did most things, efficiently, without ornamentation. They ate what she cooked, and they were glad of it, and they showed that gladness in the way men on a working outfit show most things, which is to say they showed up on time, and they didn't complain, and they cleaned their plates. Cord showed it differently. He showed it the way he showed most things, which was quietly and specifically and in a way that required you to be paying attention to catch. It was the 6th week when she caught him watching her, really watching her, not the fraction of a second thing she'd noticed before, but a longer look, and she was carrying the big pot of stew from the stove to the table, and she nearly missed a step because of it. She didn't miss it. She was a woman who had been carrying heavy things for a long time, and she had excellent balance, and she was not about to drop a pot of stew because a man was looking at her. But she felt it land somewhere in her chest, that look like a stone dropped into still water. She set the pot down. She went back to the stove. She did not look at him. That night, after the supper things were washed and Calla was asleep and the bunkhouse had gone quiet, Nora sat on the kitchen steps, the solid, fixed steps, and looked at the dark range and thought about what she was doing. Not the biscuits specifically, the whole of it. The keeping of the plate warm, the noticing of the wood and the step and the horses. The way she had started, without quite deciding to, paying attention to the shape of his days the way you pay attention to weather. Not because you can change it, but because knowing it matters. She was not a foolish woman. She was not a romantic woman, or at least she had stopped being one, or at least she had put that part of herself somewhere it wouldn't cost her anything. She knew what she was doing. She knew what the extra biscuit meant, what the warm plate meant, what the watching meant. She knew it the way you know things you haven't said out loud yet, completely, and with a kind of low-level terror that was not entirely unpleasant. She sat on the steps for a long time. The night was warm, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they get out on the range when there's no other light to compete with them, and somewhere out in the dark a coyote said something brief and unanswered. She thought about Dale. She thought about Calla. She thought about the particular weight of starting something again, of opening a door you'd closed carefully and locked from the inside. She went to bed without resolving any of it. That was the honest thing to do. Some things don't resolve on a schedule, and forcing them only breaks them. The crisis, when it came the way most crises do, on a working ranch, sideways, out of a clear sky, on a day when everything else was already complicated. It was the 8th week. The season was at its peak, which meant the men were pushing hard and the tempers were shorter than usual, and the margin for error in everything had narrowed to almost nothing. A section of fence on the North Range had come down in the night. No one knew how, whether it was a downpost or an animal or something else, and 40 head had drifted through the gap and onto the neighboring spread, which belonged to a man named Cutter Baines, who was the kind of neighbor who kept careful track of what he was owed and never let an opportunity to press an advantage go past uncollected. Gus Harlan had ridden out at first light with Aldous and 3 of the hands to deal with it, which left the bunkhouse short and the remaining men stretched thin across the day's work. The mood at breakfast was tight. Nobody was rude. Nobody was loud about it. But you could feel it in the room the way you can feel a storm before it arrives. A change in pressure, a kind of collective bracing. Cord had come in for the corral, same as always, and sat down his place, same as always, and Nora had put his plate in front of him, the warm one from the back of the stove with the extra biscuit, and he had looked at it for that fraction of a second, same as always. And then Pete, the younger of the 2 brothers, who was 19 and not always careful about what he said when he was tired and anxious, had said from across the table, "Must be nice, getting this special treatment." He'd said it with a grin. Not mean exactly, just careless. The kind of thing a 19-year-old says when he's trying to lighten a heavy room and doesn't think about the weight of the words before they leave his mouth. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of men eating. The other kind. Nora was at the stove. She had her back to the room. She did not turn around. She kept her hands moving, kept herself occupied with the pan she was cleaning, and she waited to see what the room would do with the thing Pete had dropped into it. Cord picked up his fork. He cut a piece of biscuit. He ate it. Then he looked across the table at Pete, and whatever was in his face, when he did it was quiet enough that you couldn't call anger, but it was something that had edges. "You want it," he said. Pete blinked. "What?" "The biscuit." "You want it, it's yours." Pete looked at the biscuit on Cord's plate. Then he looked at Cord. Then he looked at the table in front of him, which had its own biscuit on it, same as everyone else's. "No," Pete said. "I was just no." "All right then," Cord said, and went back to eating. That was the end of it. The table picked up its noise again, slowly, the way a fire catches. A word here, the clink of a fork there, and then the ordinary sound of men eating before a hard day's work. Pete didn't say anything else. He ate his breakfast, and he was quieter than usual for the rest of the morning, which was probably good for him. Nora had heard all of it. She had not moved from the stove. When the men filed out and the room emptied, she stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment with the pan in her hands and felt something move through her that she couldn't quite name. Something warm and complicated, something that had to do with being defended without being made into a spectacle, with being protected in a way that didn't require her to be helpless. She heard his boots stop at the door. She didn't turn around. "He didn't mean anything by it," Cord said. "I know," she said. A pause, the kind that has weight in it. "I'm sorry anyway," he said, "for the awkward of it." She turned around then. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which was not something she'd seen him do before, and he looked not uncomfortable exactly. More like a man who had said the thing he needed to say and was waiting to see if it landed right. "The biscuits are better warm," she said. "That's all it is." He looked at her for a moment. That careful look, reading the small print. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and put his hat on and went to work. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left. The pan was still in her hands. The morning light was coming through the window at a long angle, the way it does in late summer, gold and a little dusty, and it lay across the floor in a stripe that reached almost to the stove. She set the pan down. She made 16 biscuits for supper. The fence situation with Cutter Baines resolved itself over 3 days and left Gus Harlan in a mood that was several degrees colder than his usual and left the outfit generally relieved that it hadn't been worse. Baines had kept 12 of the 40 head as what he called compensation for the trouble, which Gus had argued against and ultimately accepted because the alternative was a legal fight that would cost more than 12 cattle and take longer than the season. He came back from the final meeting with Baines looking like a man who had swallowed something that disagreed with him and intended to digest it in private. He came into the kitchen that evening after the supper things were done and Calla was in bed and Nora was at the table with the week's accounts, which was part of her arrangement with Gus. She kept the kitchen books in exchange for a small addition to her wages, and she was good at it, had always been good with numbers, which was one of those useful things about herself she had discovered out of necessity. Gus sat down across from her. He poured himself a cup of the coffee she kept on the stove in the evenings. He looked at the account book for a moment without speaking. 12 head, he said finally. "I heard," she said. Baines is he stopped. Reconsidered. "He's a difficult man." "He is," she agreed. Gus drank his coffee. He was quiet for a while, the way he was when he was working something out, and Nora let him be quiet because she had learned in the months she'd worked for him that his silences were part of his thinking and interrupting them didn't help anyone. "How are the men doing?" he asked eventually. "Working hard. Tired. Pete Roof said something at breakfast he shouldn't have, and he's been sorry about all day, which is probably enough." Gus looked at her. "What did he say?" "Nothing that requires your attention." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way he did when he decided to trust someone's judgment. "All right." He finished his coffee. He stood up. At the door, he stopped, the way people did in her kitchen. She had noticed. It was a room that made people pause at the threshold, as if leaving it required a moment of preparation. "Dalloway's a good hand," he said, not looking at her, looking at the door. "He is," she said, carefully. "Plans to stay on after the season, if I'll have him. Asked me last week." She didn't say anything. She looked at the account book. "Thought you should know," Gus said, and went out. She sat at the table for a long time after that. The lamp burned low. Outside, the range was dark and enormous, and the night sounds came in through the cracked window. The horses moving in the corral, the distant sound of the creek, the ordinary music of a place that was alive and going about its business regardless of what the people in it were feeling. Cord Dalloway was staying. He had decided before any of this, before the biscuits, before the fixed step, before the doorway conversation that morning, or maybe not before all of it, maybe at the same time as all of it. Maybe the decision and the small, careful gestures were part of the same thing, the same slow turning toward something he hadn't let himself name yet either. She closed the account book. She banked the fire. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. The season turned in the way seasons do. Not all at once, but in accumulation, the mornings getting a degree cooler each week, the light changing its angle, the cattle settling into the rhythms of the fall range. The urgent work of the peak weeks gave way to the steadier, less frantic work of the later season, and the men relaxed by degrees. The tightness going out of the bunkhouse the way tension goes out a rope when the load is lifted. In that easing, things had room to surface that the busy weeks had kept submerged. Cord started talking to Calla. Not a lot. Not in the way of a man making an effort to charm a child. Nora had seen that approach, and it never worked on Calla anyway, who had a finely calibrated instinct for performance. He talked to her the way he talked to most things, which was directly and without condescension, as if she were a person with her own views worth knowing. He asked her what she was reading when she was reading. He told her the names of the horses, the real names he'd given them in his own head, which were different from the working names they went by and which were considerably more dignified. He answered her questions about the cattle with the same patience he brought to everything, and she had a lot of questions because she was 7 and curious and had been watching the operation of the ranch with the same careful attention her mother brought to most things. Nora watched this happen. She watched it the way she watched most things, from a slight distance, through the work of her hands, with a face that didn't announce what she was feeling. But she felt it, the particular feeling of watching someone be good to your child. There's almost nothing that lands harder than that, and she was not immune to it, had never pretended to be. One afternoon, it was a Wednesday. She remembered it was a Wednesday because she had been making the week's bread, and Wednesday was bread day. Calla came in from outside with a piece of paper in her hand. On it, in a careful and not particularly elegant hand, was a drawing of a horse. Mr. Cord drew it, Calla said. He said it was Pepper, the gray one. Nora looked at the drawing. It was not a skilled drawing. It was the drawing of a man who had made the attempt because a child had asked him to and had given it his honest effort regardless of the result. Pepper the gray horse was recognizable as a horse, which was probably the best you could say for it, but there was something in the way the legs were drawn, carefully one at a time, like he'd thought about each one, that made it somehow better than it had any right to be. "It's good," Calla said, with complete sincerity. "It is," Nora said. She put it on the shelf above the stove, between the tin of salt and the tin of baking powder, where it stayed for the rest of the season. The night it finally happened was a night in late September, when the season was winding down and the air had the first real bite of fall in it, and the stars were back to their winter brightness, hard and clear and very far away. Most of the hands had gone into town. It was a Saturday, and Gus gave the men Saturday evenings when the work allowed, and the bunkhouse was quiet, and the ranch had a different feel to it, the particular feel of a place that is briefly, partially at rest. Nora was on the kitchen steps. She had a cup of tea. Calla was asleep. The night was very still. She heard him before she saw him, his boots on the ground, the particular sound of his walk, which she had learned the way you learn the sounds of a place you've lived in long enough. He came around the corner of the bunkhouse and stopped when he saw her. He had his hat in his hand again. "Didn't know you were out here," he said. "I come out most nights," she said, "when it's quiet." He stood there for a moment, not leaving, not quite coming closer. The space between them was maybe 15 feet, and it had the quality of something that was either going to stay as it was or change, and they both knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, meaning the step below hers. There was only the one set of steps. "Go ahead," she said. He sat. He turned his hat in his hands. The night was around them, large and dark, and full of the small sounds of the range, the horses, the creek, a night bird somewhere in the cottonwoods by the water. She drank her tea. He was quiet. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that two people arrive at when they've been paying attention to each other for long enough that the silence is content. After a while he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I'm going to take a minute to find the words." She waited. He turned the hat. He looked out at the dark range. "I know what the biscuit meant," he said. "I knew the first time. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what I had the right to say. And then I kept not saying anything because it felt like if I named it, I might break it. Like it was something that needed to stay quiet for a while, to stay real." She held her cup in both hands. The tea was warm against her palms. "I fixed the step," he said. "I split the wood. I know you saw. I know you knew what that was. I wasn't trying to be mysterious about it. I didn't have the words yet, either." The night bird said something in the cottonwoods, then went quiet. "I'm not a man who makes promises he doesn't keep," Cord said. "And I'm not a man who says things to fill up space. So I'm going to say this one thing, and I'm going to mean it, and then I'm going to let you decide what to do with it." He paused. "I would like to know you better. I would like to earn the right to know you better. I'm not in a hurry about it. I know what you've been through, or some of it, enough to know it's not a small thing. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I wanted to say it, out loud, so it was real." She was quiet for a long moment. The cup was warm. The night was enormous. She thought about Dale, the way she always did when something important happened. Not with grief, not anymore, not exactly, but with a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition of what had been and what had changed. "You stayed," she said, "after the season. Gus told me." "Yes. Was that part of it?" He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. "It was all of it," he said. "Or most of it. The work is good. The outfit is good. But yes, most of it." She set her cup down on the step beside her. She looked at the dark range, the same view she looked at every night, the same stars, the same enormous quiet. It looked different tonight, or she looked at it differently. One of those things. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not. I've been on my own for 2 years, and I've gotten particular about things. About how the kitchen runs, and how Calla is treated, and what I will and won't put up with. I'm not going to change those things." "I know," he said. "You don't know yet," she said. "Not really, but you might if you stay." "That's what I'm hoping," he said. She picked up her cup. She drank the last of the tea. The night was still, and the stars were hard and clear and very far away, and somewhere in the cottonwoods the night bird tried again, and this time something answered it. "The biscuits," she said. "I'm going to keep making them the way I make them." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it. Out loud. So it was real." He was quiet for a moment, and then, very quietly, he laughed. It was a small sound. Genuine. The laugh of a man who has been surprised by something in the best possible way. She did not laugh, but something in her face changed, something that had been held carefully for a long time, easing by a degree, and if he saw it, and she thought he did, because he was the kind of man who paid that kind of attention, he had the sense not to remark on it. They sat on the steps for another hour. They talked some, about the ranch, about the coming winter, about Calla's questions regarding the horses, about nothing in particular. The talking was easy in the way that talking is easy when the important thing has already been said, and everything else is just the ordinary business of two people getting to know each other, which is its own kind of pleasure, unhurried and specific. When she went inside, she paused in the doorway. He was still on the step, looking at the range. "Good night, Cord," she said. "Good night, Nora," he said. First time he'd used her name. She had known it would matter when he did. She had not known quite how much. She went inside. She banked the fire. She checked on Calla, who was asleep with the absolute completeness of a child who has no unresolved business with the day. She stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for a moment and looked at her in the dark and felt something that was made up of so many things that didn't have a single name. Love and protectiveness and grief and hope, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying a great deal for a long time and has just maybe found someone willing to help carry some of it. She went to bed. She slept. In the morning, she made 16 biscuits. She made them the way she always made them. The flour and the fat and the buttermilk worked together quickly, the way her mother had taught her, the way she had done it 1,000 times, the way she would do it 1,000 times more. She pulled them from the oven when the tops were gold and the bottoms were just barely darker than that, the exact moment that required attention to catch and that she never missed. She counted them out onto the plates. 14 plates, 14 biscuits, and one plate on the back of the stove, warm with 2 on it, because he would be coming in from the corral and the horses would have needed looking at, and she had made enough. The men came in their order. The brothers first, then the older hands, then Aldous. The room filled with the sound of a working morning, boots and voices and the scrape of chairs and the smell of coffee and bacon and the particular warmth of a kitchen that has been going since before dawn. And then Cord, coming in from the corral, same as always, hanging his hat, sitting down at his place, looking at the plate for that fraction of a second. He looked up. She was at the stove. She did not look at him, but she was almost smiling. He could tell, if he was paying attention, from the set of her shoulders, from the way she held herself. Something looser in it than usual, something that was not quite a smile, but was what a smile comes from. He was paying attention. He always had been. He picked up his fork. He ate his breakfast. He thanked her when he left, the same as always, with the same quiet economy of words. But when he said it this time, there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, or had been there all along and was simply no longer hidden. She said, "You're welcome," the same as always, and meant it differently than she ever had. The season ended the way seasons end, not with ceremony but with completion. The last of the cattle settled on the winter range, the accounts balanced, the equipment stored and repaired and made ready for the next time. The hands who were leaving collected their wages and said their goodbyes and rode out in ones and twos over the course of a week, and the outfit contracted into its winter shape, smaller and quieter, and turned inward against the cold that was coming. Pete Roof, the younger brother, stopped by the kitchen on his last morning. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. They all did that. She had decided it was something about the kitchen that required it. And he looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said. At breakfast. Back in the 8th week." "I know," she said. "It's all right." "It wasn't right," he said. "I knew it wasn't right when I said it. I said it anyway." "That's the thing about 19, she said. "You usually know. You just say it anyway. You'll get better at the gap between knowing and doing." He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then decided against it. He put his hat on. He left. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window, young and straight in the saddle, the way young men are before the years put their weight on them. She hoped he'd get better at the gap. Most people did, eventually. Gus Harlan came to the kitchen that evening with the winter arrangements, what the reduced crew would look like, what the work would be, what her wages would be for the quieter months. He sat across from her at the table the way he always did, and he was direct about the numbers the way he always was, and she agreed to what was fair, and they shook hands on it, which was how they always did things and which she appreciated about him. At the door, he stopped. He looked at the drawing above the stove. Pepper the gray horse, careful and not particularly skilled, and somehow better than it had any right to be. "Dalloway's a good man," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not prying, just acknowledging something the way Gus acknowledged most things, with a directness that was almost gentle. "Good," he said, and went out. Calla came in from outside and climbed onto her chair at the table and looked at her mother with those wide, careful eyes that missed nothing. "Is Mr. Cord staying?" she asked. "He is," Nora said. Calla considered this. She looked at the drawing above the stove. She looked back at her mother. "Good," she said, with the flat certainty of a child who has already decided and is simply confirming what she already knew. Nora put a biscuit in front of her daughter. Calla ate it without ceremony, the way children eat things, completely, without self-consciousness, with the full attention of someone who has not yet learned to be anywhere other than exactly where she is. Outside, the first real cold of the season was coming down from the north, the kind of cold that means it, the kind that settles in and stays. The range was going gray and gold in the last of the afternoon light, the grass bending in the wind, the sky enormous and pale above it all. It was the kind of landscape that could make you feel very small or very alive, depending on the day and what you were carrying into it. Nora stood at the window for a moment and looked at it. She thought about the summer, the heat and the work, and the 14 men and the biscuits counted out every morning. She thought about a fixed step and a split woodpile and a drawing of a gray horse. She thought about a man sitting on the steps in the dark, turning his hat in his hands, taking his time to find the right words because the wrong ones wouldn't do. She thought about the particular courage it takes to start something again. Not the loud kind of courage, not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up in small decisions made over and over again until they add up to something that can hold weight. She had that kind of courage. She had always had it. She had just needed, maybe, someone to recognize it for what it was. She turned back to the kitchen. The fire needed banking. The supper needed starting. Calla needed her biscuit finished and her hands washed and her lessons looked at before the light went. There was work to do, the same as always, the ordinary work of a life being lived carefully and well. She started the fire. She got the flour down from the shelf. She counted out what she'd need for the evening, and then she added a little more because there was one more person at the table now, or there would be, and she had always made enough. That was who she was. That was what she did. And it had always turned out, for the people who were paying the right kind of attention, that this was its own kind of declaration. Not loud, not performed, just real and steady, and there every morning when you came in from the cold. The extra biscuit, the warm plate, the fixed step, the drawing on the shelf. Small things, the smallest things. And somehow, between two people who had both learned the hard way to say what they meant through what they did, Those small things had built something solid enough to stand on. Something that would hold through the winter and past it into whatever came next. Cord came in for supper that evening last. Same as always from the corral, same as always. He hung his hat. He sat down. He looked at his plate. There were 2 biscuits on it. He looked up. She was at the stove. She did not look at him. He ate his supper. He thanked her when he left. And this time when he went out the door, he paused on the step, the solid, fixed step, and she heard him pause, and she did not look up from the pan she was cleaning, but she was listening, and he knew she was listening, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole of it, really. 2 people in the ordinary hours of an ordinary life, paying attention to each other in the only language they both knew how to trust. Not the loud language, not the easy language, the one that costs something, the one that means what it says. The fire burned. The night came down over the range, cold and clear and full of stars. And in the kitchen, a woman cleaned her pan and counted herself, quietly and without drama, among the people who had been found by something they hadn't known they were still looking for. She put the pan away. She turned down the lamp. She went to check on her daughter. And in the morning, she made biscuits. Enough for everyone. And one more. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, you already know what it means to pay attention to the quiet things. The ones that don't announce themselves. The ones that only land if you're watching closely enough. That's what this channel is built on. Stories like this one. The kind that earn what they feel. If that's something you want more of, subscribe. Leave a like if this one stayed with you. And come back. There's always more on the stove.